The quiet collapse before the end. There is a point in every empath's life that is never loud, never dramatic, and never immediately noticeable. It does not come with arguments, shouting, or revenge. It comes in silence. A silence so deep that even the person causing it does not realize they have already lost something irreversible. At first, an empath feels everything too deeply. They absorb emotions like a sponge absorbs water. Joy, pain, betrayal, love, anger, nothing passes through them without leaving a mark. They forgive easily, they understand deeply, and they stay longer than they should. Not because they are weak, but because they see potential where others see failure. They believe people can change, heal, and become better. But what nobody understands is that every empath has a limit. And the tragedy is by the time you notice it, it is already too late. Because an empath does not stop caring suddenly. They stop caring slowly, piece by piece, moment by moment, until one day there is nothing left to give. And that is the moment everything changes. Before that final shift, there are warning signs. Not spoken, not obvious, but deeply psychological. The empath starts to withdraw emotionally while still physically present. They still reply to messages, still smile in conversations, still show up, but something inside them is no longer engaged. It feels like watching someone sit in a room while their mind has already left the building. They begin to analyze instead of feel. Where once they felt love, they now calculate patterns. Where once they forgave instantly, they now pause and think. Where once they gave second chances freely, they now hesitate. This hesitation is the beginning of the end. Because an empath who starts thinking instead of feeling is already stepping out of emotional connection. The most dangerous misconception about empaths is that they are endlessly forgiving, that they can tolerate anything, that their compassion has no expiration date. But what people don't understand is that their compassion is not infinite, it is renewable, and it depends entirely on emotional safety. When that safety is repeatedly broken, something inside them starts to shut down. Not explosively, but quietly. Like a system slowly powering off to protect itself. They begin to detach emotionally while still maintaining presence in reality. They stop reacting strongly. They stop explaining themselves. They stop trying to fix things that are clearly broken. And the most terrifying stage begins when they stop hoping. Because hope is the last thread connecting them to emotional investment. Once hope disappears, love becomes memory, effort becomes routine, and presence becomes obligation. At this stage, the empath is still physically there, but emotionally they are already halfway gone. You may still think everything is normal. You may still see their kindness. You may still receive their responses. But internally, something fundamental has changed. They are no longer trying to be understood. They are no longer trying to be loved correctly. They are no longer trying to fix emotional imbalance. They are observing. And observation is the first step of emotional exit. This is where most people make a fatal mistake. They assume silence means peace. They assume calmness means stability. But with an empath, calmness after emotional exhaustion is not peace, it is resignation. They are no longer reacting because reacting requires emotional investment. And emotional investment is exactly what they have started to withdraw. Inside their mind, a quiet process begins. Emotional inventory. They replay moments. They analyze patterns. They connect dots that they ignored before. Not because they are seeking revenge, but because they are finally seeing clearly without emotional distortion. And what they usually discover is painful but simple. They cared more than they were cared for. They gave more than they received. They understood more than they were understood. And they stayed longer than they should have. This realization does not make them angry immediately. It makes them still. And that stillness is more dangerous than anger. Because anger demands action. Stillness demands distance. At this stage, they start emotionally unplugging from situations that once triggered them deeply. The things that once made them anxious no longer affect them. The words that once hurt them now pass through without impact. It is not healing. It is shut down. The empath is not becoming stronger in the emotional sense. They are becoming unreachable. And once that threshold is crossed, the relationship does not end with a fight. It ends with disappearance. Not physical disappearance at first, but emotional absence. They are there but not reachable. They are present but not available. They are involved but not invested. And slowly the final transformation begins. The empath stops explaining themselves, because explaining is an attempt to be understood, and they no longer believe understanding is possible. They stop chasing clarity, because clarity requires two willing participants. They stop fixing emotional chaos, because they realize they are not the source of it. And most importantly, they stop reacting to pain the same way. Pain no longer pulls them closer. It pushes them further away. This is the point where many relationships unknowingly die. Not because of a final argument, but because one person has already left, emotionally while still physically present. And the other person doesn't notice until the absence becomes undeniable. Because when an empath stops caring, they don't announce it. They don't warn you. They don't explain it. They simply stop. And once they stop, there is no emotional mechanism left to restart what was lost. The point of no return, when caring turns into absence, the most misunderstood phase of an empath's emotional journey is not when they are overwhelmed, but when they are empty. Emptiness is not sadness. It is not anger. It is not even pain. It is absence of reaction where reaction used to live. When an empath reaches this stage, they are no longer emotionally negotiating with reality. They are no longer trying to fix, repair, or reconnect. Something fundamental has already shut down inside them. And what replaces emotional engagement is quiet detachment. At this point, people around them often misinterpret the change. They assume the empath is finally at peace, or learning to ignore negativity. But that is a surface interpretation. Internally, something very different is happening. The empath is no longer participating emotionally. They are observing life instead of living it emotionally through others. This is the true shift, from participation to observation. Once this shift happens, the relationship dynamic changes permanently. The empath no longer seeks emotional validation. They no longer wait for apologies that never come. They no longer expect people to suddenly understand what they repeatedly failed to understand, because expectation itself has dissolved. And without expectation, there is no disappointment. But there is also no attachment. This is where people realize too late what they had. Because while empaths are deeply forgiving, they are also deeply final when they decide internally that something no longer deserves emotional investment. And this decision is not emotional, it is structural. It is like a system removing itself from a network that repeatedly fails to provide stability. At this stage, the empath becomes extremely calm, but not in the way people assume calmness to be positive. This calmness is not healing energy, it is disconnection. They stop overthinking conversations. They stop replaying emotional scenarios. They stop analyzing intentions. Because analysis itself requires emotional interest, and interest has already faded. What remains is functional interaction only. They respond when necessary. They engage when required. But the emotional layer underneath everything is gone. And this is where the danger lies for those who took them for granted, because the empath no longer reacts to emotional manipulation. They no longer respond to guilt-based communication. They no longer fall into cycles of apology and repetition. Not because they have learned boundaries in the traditional sense, but because the emotional system that used to respond has been shut down. At this stage, love does not turn into hate. It turns into neutrality. And neutrality is the final form of detachment, because hate still means connection. But neutrality means absence. When someone reaches this point, trying to pull them back emotionally is almost impossible. Not because they are stubborn, but because there is nothing left to pull. You cannot revive emotional engagement in a system that has already stopped processing emotional signals. This is the moment where many people panic. They suddenly realize the empath is not reacting anymore. Not to love, not to pain, not to guilt, not even to loss. And in that panic, they try harder. They text more. They explain more. They apologize more. But all of it arrives too late, because the empath is no longer inside the emotional conversation. They are outside it, watching it, not feeling it. And the most painful truth is this. When an empath reaches this level, they do not come back the same. Even if they return physically, the emotional version of them that once existed is gone. Because what broke them was not a single moment, it was repetition, repeated misunderstanding, repeated emotional neglect, repeated imbalance between giving and receiving. Over time, this does not create anger. It creates absence. And absence is irreversible. At this stage, the empath does not leave loudly. They leave quietly while still present. They stop investing. They stop initiating. They stop repairing. And eventually, the bond becomes one-sided without conflict. Just silence where connection used to exist. And this is the final reality. When an empath stops caring, it is not an emotional reaction. It is the end result of emotional exhaustion reaching completion. There is no argument that can restart it. There is no apology that can fully restore it. There is no realization that can reverse it instantly. Because what is gone is not just feeling, it is the willingness to feel. And once that is gone, the empath does not return to who they were before. They return as someone who understands everything but invests in very little. And that is why the most dangerous moment is not when they love deeply. It is when they stop loving at all. Because that is when it's over.